Shalom and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bread, where we discuss the weekly Torah portion. And this week's Parashat is called Re'eh, and it is the fourth Parashat of the book of Devarim, also called Deuteronomy. And this week's Parashat is called Re'eh, and that means behold. And in this week's Parashat, we get quite a few laws about everything. It starts off with, behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. And my message this year is called the power of observation, and it's for 2010-11. So we start off with this concept of re'eh, which is to behold. It's to see, to observe. He's basically starting off saying, behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a cursing. And I think before we even get into it, it's important to kind of take a look and say, what does this mean, re'eh? What does this mean, behold? What does that have to do? And I think that what I've found in my own Torah studies is that it starts, good thought and good observation starts and is really powered by good questions, questions that you ask yourself. So the first thing that you can ask yourself is, what is it that I'm observing? It's not about what it means. A lot of people make the mistakes by trying to determine what things mean, or as they're observing them, instead of just observing them like a scientist does to see, okay, what's here, they try and as they're seeing it, to put meanings to it. And that creates a big problem. As a matter of fact, you see this in the Messianic world and in Bible study world, because people who already come in with a set of beliefs and biases, as they read, like say a New Testament Christian comes in and reads the Old Testament, they bring in that, their biases, that changes the way they even process the information, changes how they observe things. Because if they believe, oh, well, this is done away with, or this was just for the Jews of that time, then they're not observing it fully and looking at details. They may be classifying some of those details as irrelevant or dispensational, or that was just for that culture, or it's just historical, and therefore missing out on observations because they put it in the wrong categories. So I think that coming in with a blank, it's kind of like a food taster or something. If you have something on your palate, that's going to, just like how they have food pairings, certain things taste differently when you pair them with contrast of other things. So in order to cleanse your mental and your spiritual palate, you need to be able to go into situations trying to remove your own bias, trying to cleanse your own mind from those bias when you go in, and just listen and try and listen to where the other person's coming from. Don't start making assumptions and attaching meanings to things too early. Just see what's there. We start with the what. After we get there, done with the what, another great question is, how many possible observations are there here? What most people will do is they'll make a problem. It's what I call the A-B problem. They, just like the Pharisees, they give, oh, it's either this answer or that answer, and they were trying to trap Mashiach by giving him, something where either A or B is going to cause him to be in trouble. And you'll see this many times even when people discuss the scriptures. The problem with A-B thinking is it's very close. It's like saying, are you a Republican or a Democrat? It makes the assumption that these two parties represent all parties. If you're not this, then you must be that. And people do that when they're studying the scriptures, and that creates a big problem too, because a lot of times if you think that it's an A or B argument, you give up the right to understand that there could be C and D options, or it could be A and B in a way that you don't understand A or B. And so when we talk about observing, to re'eh, to behold, we have to realize, number one, that there's probably more possibilities. You have to leave that door open than what you might be seeing, and just asking yourself that question: is there other opportunities or possibilities that I'm not seeing here can yield results? And sometimes you don't have the awareness to see those. You can only see what you see. That's why the power of fellowship is so great, is because it gives you a chance to hear something and see an angle on something that you would have never seen on your own. And that can remove a bit of blindness that you have based on your own level of understanding and your own biases and all that. So it's important to understand that it may be A or B is rarely the case. It could be A and B, it could be C, A and C, B and C, D, none of the above, where you have to put things on the shelf because you don't have enough information to make an intelligent decision. Or you have to make a decision based on not enough information, knowing that hopefully, some more revelation or experience is going to help provide information for you in the future. So the next question you have to ask about information is why. Why is it this way? Why did it give me that detail? How many observations are there? If you're just observing two things, maybe there's more in the text. Maybe there's an if and a then that tells us that we're dealing with a situation where one thing is dependent on the other. I loved I think it was last week's Parashat was a kev, which is if, and it's usually an if and then situation. So if you keep my commandments, then you shall be blessed, or if you keep my commandments, then I will keep the covenant with you. You have all these type of situations that everybody wants to take the then part without doing the if part independently, and those connections are there for a reason. And we have to respect them. Again, we have to re'eh them. We have to observe the parts of the sentence when we're reading them. A lot of people, they're arguing points, they're bringing up text where they didn't really pay attention to what the text actually said. They left out a big if or the word and, which requires or connects two things, and they're trying to isolate one thing without adding the other thing that's connected to it. So there's many situations where we have to do that. So we ask ourselves, what is here? Not what do I think, or jumping to a conclusion. We want to hurry up and write the answer. We don't want to do our work and show our work of how we got that. How many possibilities? Are there more possibilities? Make the assumption that there is some that you're missing. Why? Why do I need to know these details? Why? What am I not seeing? Then you go into your biases. What if I change sides? A lot of times when you're looking at something, it's what I call reflexive thought. If this is true, if we're commanded to do something, then the reflexive thought is that we're not to do the opposite of that, and vice versa. A lot of times you get additional information that causes our mind to expand when we look at those other options. And a lot of times if you're arguing with somebody or you're talking about a point in the Torah, many times people only look at their side. That again is not a good power of observation because they're blind to the other person's perspective because they're just trying to share their perspective. So it's okay to share your perspective. Then you need to unplug and you need to spend all your energy focusing on understanding their perspective. Change sides. Try and believe what they're saying and try and thoroughly understand it. Even if you don't want to believe in the end, you can always jump across the other way, but you'll have a better idea of what they're talking about when you've changed sides and tried to believe it and tried to justify it. It'll help you to understand it sometimes better than the person you're arguing with. That way, if it's not true, you'll understand even more than they do why it's not true and where it falls apart. The next point, and again, there's just these basic 7 points that I look at in what it means to observe and the power of observation. The next thing is the 1%. It's saying I'm always going to leave that 1% option that I've got this wrong, that I've seen it wrong, that I haven't seen it all, that there's more information, more observations I missed, that I didn't put them in the right perspective or context, that I don't know absolutely everything and haven't observed every detail of something. Okay, that seems like common sense that we would say, okay, no one should think that they know everything in the universe or they understand it in perfection. But yet most of us run into big trouble because we ultimately act like we do. We close the gate on it. We say, okay, I know that now. Or, okay, I read that study. I thoroughly understand the biblical timeline, or blah, blah, blah. We have all these things that we believe we know. And most of that by mechanics of saying, all these things are in my 100% pile. And what I'm saying is you absolutely have to have only a 99% pile and then a lesser. Because then you won't get in the caught that Kepha or Peter did when he says, I won't deny you. Well, Mashiach said, yeah, you're going to deny me, he didn't believe it because he had such self-confidence in what he was saying. He didn't leave that 1% open so that he could find out where he was wrong. And that creates the blindness that the Pharisees were guilty of. The last 2 points are, number one, the shelf. You got to know when you don't have very much information. We want to get the right answer so fast. We want microwave answers to the universe and to spirituality. And that creates a problem because what most people do, it's a fast food spiritual mentality, that they want to do a little bit of study in complex topics, and they want to just wrap it up and get to the point and get to the summary. And I need an answer here that I can believe in, stand firm on. And they don't have a shelf where they put things up on and say, hey, you know what? I spent 8 hours studying this, but I can also see in that 1% that there's some other things that I may not understand or I'm not seeing. So I don't have to have a hard conclusion. I'm going to put that on the shelf and come back to it. Maybe I have to spend another 8 hours. Maybe I have to fellowship with 10 more people. Maybe it's going to take my lifetime and I'm never going to solve that. You have to be willing to do that and have a shelf you can put things on at all varying levels of your understanding. The last thing is to revisit. You get new evidence. Okay, most of us, we're human beings. We're not the same, we don't have the same level of intelligence as we did when we were 5 years old. Why? Because we had new information, new vocabulary, new definitions, new experience, new exposure to other information, and so we grow and we learn, and that's where wisdom comes in. So it's not wise if you think you've got it all figured out right now where you are. If you think in 5 years you won't be any smarter or have changed your mind about anything, then that's not wisdom either. That's being naive and delusional. You've changed your mind before, you've been wrong before, meaning that everything you believe is absolute truth today can be wrong in your own future. You yourself will find yourself wrong 10 years, 20 years from now, because you'll have grown. So if you know that is happening, then you know you shouldn't be overconfident or overzealous in what you currently believe today. You have to always be willing to revisit things, always looking for new evidence, because what's the fear? If your original understanding was correct, there's still depth of understanding that can be added. Whether it was right or wrong, that's just the first issue. Then there's the depth of understanding of how deep you understand and how vast your knowledge is in where that fits in the universe with everything else. So it's good to constantly revisit things and to be striving for new evidence and absolutely be searching out people who will tell you where your ideas are wrong, because they're going to try and point your weaknesses out. And some of those weaknesses you didn't see before. And those are areas you actually need to go study and come to a conclusion. Don't just be quick to defend it. Someone gets you with a good question that you can't quite answer. Say, hey, you know what? I'm going to need to check that out. And I'm going to come back to you. And because I want to have the truth. I don't want to be right. I want to have the truth. So I'm going to go back and study those things. Thank you for pointing out the weakness in my theory. And that's where great fellowship comes in, when you can do that with people in an open forum where you're not throwing stones at each other. So anyway, all that leads us to these good questions we're going to ask. This is the power of observation. Behold, re'eh. And the very first word he says, behold, and then he says, I set before you a blessing and a cursing. So everybody says, oh, okay, that's easy. But it isn't easy. He just told you, behold, open your eyes up. Question what this means. Why is it a blessing and cursing? What is that? It means that there's a causation. It means if there's a blessing and a cursing, if, right, the ekev, you obey the commandments, you'll be blessed, and if you don't, you'll be cursed. So it's saying there's a causation here between keeping the commandments and not. And what does that mean? What are we supposed to observe about that? That's the story of the whole Torah. Re'eh, ekev, last week's Parashat, re'eh and ekev. Behold, look, observe the if, the ekev, the causation between these stories of people who obeyed God and what happened to them, and those who disobeyed God and what happened to them. This is a synopsis of the whole Torah right here in those 2 words for the last 2 weeks, Parashat, ekev, and re'eh. We are to learn how to observe. We miss a lot when we go on. We just zim right. Oh yeah, I know blessings and cursings. No, you don't. Slow it down and contemplate what this means and what every detail of this means and what its bigger ramifications and how it's connected to other things. So we learn that there's a causation. That's the big thing in this week's Parashat. There's a causation between your actions and what you do. This whole concept of re'eh, is to behold, is to see, is going to take us into all the different points. We start with the next point, which is idolatry. That we're to destroy the the places of worship and the idols, the idolatry out of the land when we go in there. See, the idolatry, what does that teach us? What can we observe more? It's funny that this week's Parashat is about kosher eating. You see, because a dog doesn't really chew its food that much, it swallows it whole. Whereas a clean animal, it brings it up, it chews it, it swallows it, it comes back up, it chews it again. This is one of the things that we see in a clean animal, it chews the cud. So we see it's constantly like a Torah student. It's kind of like revisiting. It's chewing it, breaking it down, trying to get deeper and deeper into smaller particles and understand it, and to extract more nutrients out of it every time. It doesn't just gobble up things the first time it hears it. And yet in religion, many people do that. And we need to be an example model of those clean animals that rightly divide the split hoof. It rightly divides the Word of God. And it chews it and studies it and brings it back and revisits it and does all this kind of stuff. So we're constantly chewing on that. And this helps us to extract more out. So when we learn about idolatry, we see a big problem. That an idol, we say, what is it? We go back to those questions, ask questions. What is idolatry? What is the essence of idolatry? It is an earthly thing that has no spirit, no spiritual element to it. It's just earthly. Now we are flesh and blood. We have a spirit and a physical body. Flesh and blood's like the inside and the outside. Flesh and spirit, same thing. We see this pattern. And what we're not supposed to have is just the outward, with no inward. So idolatry right off the bat tells us we're not supposed to just be outward, have this outward stuff. It's got to have the inward. See, God is through Mashiach both an outward in the example by sending His Son in the flesh and by creating us in the flesh. We are a being that has a flesh and a spirit combined together. And there's going to come a time at death when flesh is separated from the spirit. And so what we see is we're not supposed to be idols. So kind of like when He says the dead bury the dead, do we have people who are only earthly or only see things in the physical world and they don't see spiritual things? Yeah, that's like the blindness of the Pharisees, who couldn't understand the spiritual ramifications of the Torah, only the literal. And so we see that we're not supposed to be like that. Now, is this proven in the text? Does it verify this? Next thing, it goes to our offerings and choices, and that goes into it talks about your offering, being perfect, and this is very interesting. It talks about consuming the flesh and pouring the blood on the altar. So we have a separation between the blood and the flesh, and our offerings are like our choices. And God will separate what's behind those choices, because sometimes we can't see, but God knows. Just because you wear tzitzis doesn't mean that you're wearing it for the right reasons, or that you're looking upon them when you're about to sin and thinking about the commandments and keeping them. Some people may wear them because they like the way it looks. They think, hey, this makes me cooler than you. I'm more righteous than you. Well, that's not what the commandment for the tzitzis talks about. So God can see the hearts and the motivations, the spirit behind somebody's outward observance. So again, this ties into that same thing of idolatry, that it's supposed to be spiritual, not just outwardly. And even in this week's Parashat, it talks about eating the flesh, consuming the flesh, and it talks about which animals, which flesh we can consume. See, the blood of any animal, even the ones we could consume, had to be poured out. We weren't to eat blood. We can, it says, when we get to the core of what's being said, eat the flesh of certain animals. So we can consume the outside of some animals. We can't consume the inside, but we can remove the outside essentially when we consume it. And so we learn how to divide the outside from the inside, right? That's one of the first things. We got to pour the blood out like water into the earth, and we can take away the flesh. So we got to divide the flesh and the blood. And this goes back to idolatry. Are we dividing what is literal, like a parable, and the spiritual meaning underneath it? Are we rightly dividing, like the clean animal, the cloven hoof, the divided hoof? Are we rightly dividing the Word of God, as it says? A workman needs not to be, a workman needs not to be ashamed. It's studied to show yourself approved, as it says. So we look at this, we go into it. Next it says, don't forsake the Levi'im. The Levi'im were a model. What are the mechanics of what they do? The Levi'im were the teachers of Torah. They were the ministers of YHWH. They were the ones that stood between God and the people. They were the mediator. So all these patterns also are the same patterns that the Torah, the Word of God, is. It is the worker of God, the servant of God. It is the teacher of God's will. It is the one that is doing the job of God and serving Him. And so if we're not supposed to forsake the Levi'im, that's another way spiritually of saying we're not to forsake Torah study. Now, this goes right back into what we were talking about. If we're going to rightly divide the Word of God, if we're going to chew it like the clean animal, if we're going to be able to separate the spiritual message and the literal message and compare the two witnesses, heaven and earth, then we have to study. If we forsake that, then we're not going to be able to get to any of those other things. Then we get to this concept of those who would take you away from Elohim, even your friends. So this goes to saying that there's going to be distractions. There's going to be the people that are going to take you away from God and telling you to go. What were they doing? Telling you to go worship other Elohim. Those Elohims are like the idols. They're only literal. You're going to have some people who are going to take you away from the spiritual truths with the Word of God, with an outward thing, an earthly thing, something that doesn't contain, teachings that don't contain the spirit of the message, which is contained in the parable, is a spiritual message as Mashiach taught us. That's how he taught. He gave a parable, and then he defined what those perfectly equal spiritual definitions were right underneath the text, what each word meant spiritually. And that gave you the spiritual teachings, and then you had both witnesses, and you could compare the two and get a deeper understanding of what both the parable and the spiritual message were saying by having both witnesses. So when we see this, we see some are going to try and take you away from that. And see, if you're not even rightly dividing the Word of God, if you're using the Torah as a form of idolatry and you don't see the spirit of it, the spiritual teachings, then you'll be easily led astray. So you have to first realize that there's two components to the Scriptures. And just as Moshe came first, the literal, the parable, just like the parable came first, and then Mashiach came second, who explained to his disciples what the spiritual meanings of that parable was. If you go back and you look at the New Testament, you're going to see this pattern from start to finish of Mashiach's ministry, that he was that second witness, as it says in Revelations. He's called the true witness. The true witness is the second witness because truth must be established by two or more witnesses. So the second witness establishes what the first one says is truth or not. And so when he comes, and he's the true witness, it's called, then just as Paul's saying, first was Moshe and then Mashiach. Mashiach verified. Like Mashiach said, he said, if you would believe Moshe, you'd believe me because he wrote of me. So he said the first part, and then he came and verified it. Now it's true. And this is an important understanding to get. He had the literal, the parable, and then the spiritual, just like his disciples. He went out and gave the parable to the masses, and then it says, if you follow the patterns after each time he went and taught, he'll say, then his disciples drew near to him, and he declared the parable to them. So now he gives them the spiritual, the second witness. And now they can combine those two and get the truth out of what was really being taught. So we apply this pattern back here to what we're doing, the power of observation. And that goes to the A or B. If you're just looking at it in an A universe of the literal text, you're missing out the B. Or some people, they take some things as just spiritual and other things as just literal, and they've got a fragmented text when they need to understand that there's a literal and a spiritual to each piece of the text. And a lot of times the reason why people take some things spiritually and some things literally is because they don't like the implications that the literal meaning of that verse would be, or the spiritual, so they switch it to the other to try and avoid things. When if you don't have truth at that point, you have to learn what the two witnesses are and how they are perfectly connected, and that gives you understanding. So without getting too in-depth into that stuff, because that's a whole other message, those rules are important when we're observing, because again, it goes back, don't just look for an A or B. Realize there's more options you may need to be, more observations you may need to make in order to get the truth. So next we go in this week's Parashat to, we've talked about idolatry, the offering up, and how that represents our choices, not forsaking the Levi'im, which is Torah study, eating of the flesh, which is to rightly divide away the parable and the spiritual message. But both are offered up to God, and how this all ties into the kosher animal and eating kosher, And then we get to the year of tithe. Now, this is an interesting thing. This is about observation also. It's that you are in your world and you're going along bebopping the way you are. And it's easy to forget that there's other people who are standing right next to you in line at the store who are sweating bullets over how they're going to afford diapers for their kids because they can't pay their rent this month. And you're sitting there going, I'm going to order another latte and grab a Coke out of there, and look how maybe I'll buy a magazine. I'm not really in a financial, everyone wants more money, but I'm not in a financial bind. And this week's Parashat talks a lot about the poor. The last third of it is talking about first that there's the year of the tithe where you give your tithe to the poor. And that's every 3 years. Then in the 7th year, actually, of the land Sabbath, I think it was last week's Parashat, we learned that we leave the whole field to the poor and the stranger. They get the whole field on the 7th year when you're supposed to leave it alone. And then we also get in this verse that if there's any poor among your brethren, that you shall not only not turn away from them, but you shall open your hand wide to them. And it says, any poor. And recently I got in a conversation with somebody, and they tried to, because they've been, in my opinion, indoctrinated with a lot of political garbage and talking points, they were like, oh, the welfare, this, and oh, the lazy people are poor and they just need to get to work. And I didn't realize there's 80, and most of them have very little facts. I've heard all kinds of funny quotes that the top 1% pay 70% of the taxes in this country, and all these kind of fabricated stories. Anybody can Google it. You can go to irs.com, or I think it's .gov or whatever. You can look up the numbers. Please do so before you start spreading things that are just blatant lies. They're not true, and it's nothing hidden. It's just laziness that would keep you, you heard something on a DVD or a news clip that was used to try and manipulate people and systems, and you didn't fact check stuff. Because I can tell you right now that the top 1%, there's 146,000 of them, roughly, and they pay about 20% of the tax burden, and that's only about 50% of the total tax revenues that this country takes in, which means that the top 1% pay 10% of the revenue that this country makes in. It's not 70%. That's a pretty dramatic difference. So it's just an example. Don't believe everything that you hear. Be a Berean. Go look it up. That's what I did, and it was easy to find. It took me 5 or 10 minutes of looking, and I looked because I cared. Because before I regurgitate something that somebody says, or if somebody says something to me, I'm going to call them to the carpet and go back and say, okay, let's take a look at these numbers. And the numbers aren't hidden, and everyone can go take a look at them, and then they can speak intelligently. So the point is that, this concept of this political garbage, that comes out saying, kind of downcasting the poor as lazy and irresponsible. And I said, no, that's not true. There's people, how about the widow, right? The widow had a husband who died. And now she's got 2-3 kids. She, hasn't worked. Maybe she's been a homemaker for a long time, and she's going to get on welfare. Does that make her irresponsible? No. Does that make her lazy? No. She's trying to take care of her kids, doesn't want to ship them off to some daycare so she can go out and spend her life instead of being a mom, which is her godly duty, in my opinion, and instead, go off to have a career. That doesn't make any sense. The fact is there's some people, the husband gets up and leaves them and leaves her with the kids, and she, got little kids that, there's all kinds of reasons. I think it's ignorant to state that people are only poor because of one thing. You got 87 million people at or below the poverty level in the United States. Okay, to summarize all those people with 1 or 2 words, that's ignorant. I'll summarize that in 1 word. Normally ignorance, like a child, comes when you don't have an expanded library of reference. When you oversimplify things, it's goo-goo gaga thinking. And what I found is intelligent people over time and wise people are ones that consider more factors and they consider it before they make a statement. And politics does the opposite. It tries to narrow it down into something that they could teach a 5-year-old to repeat. It takes complex issues like our economy and different things and brings it down to little sound bites, little one-sentence sound bites and slogans for political campaigns, usually that don't tell the whole story. So, it was funny. I saw this comedian the other day, and it was hilarious because he had made a joke about this. I can't remember what it was, something about politics. He says some people, use the thing like, this guy wants to tase 7-year-olds. He goes, this was an actual campaign, negative campaign he was talking about, he saw. And he goes, that's the summary of this guy. Like some politicians just running around there with a taser going, let me get where's that little kid? I want to tase 7-year-olds. And the reality is what he was saying is, in cases of abuse or violent, with people coming with guns or knives or a violent child coming, that it would, in order to not have to shoot the kid, it would be better if they tasered him or did a non-violent way of getting the kid who was going to commit an act of violence under control. But how it was spun by political people was, it was funny, the little clip. He was talking about the voices that these negative campaign ads use, and he's like, Bob Jones wants to tase 7-year-olds, dun dun dun. And, it was just, but it goes to show you how you got to watch out for that. That is an example of poor observation, not taking into enough factors, taking things that are manipulated to, just as the Pharisees did with Mashiach. They kept trying to twist his character by presenting him an A or B thing that either way he picked, he would be, demeaned or slandered. And they could attack him that way. So you got to watch out because people are susceptible to it. I see it on Facebook all the time. People are reposting stuff all the time that's ridiculous. You just got to be careful. That's all I'll say. Whatever you believe, you can believe it. Hey, more power to you. But you need to be intelligent before you start making decisions about 87 million people. That's a lot of people. And to cast judgment so generally, swooping like that, without considering the Torah tells us that the judges were to diligently observe a matter before they make a decision. And that's not diligent observance and to diligently search out a matter when you want to summarize even 1 million people with one word. That's not just judgment. So, talking about the poor, I felt the need to defend the poor because I felt like, number one, the Torah calls for that. And this person, at one point in the conversation, tried to use the scriptures to back up what he was saying. And I said, I don't think he can use the Bible to make a slanderous remark towards the poor, because God clearly has a heart for the poor, as we see in this Parashat and all throughout the scriptures. I said, do a word search in your Bible for the word poor. And you tell me how many negative things God has to say about the poor or the needy, people who aren't even necessarily poor, just somebody in need. And in this case, it says about your poor brethren, anybody who's poor among your brethren, not the ones you select that are worthy or poor enough, that you open your hand wide sufficient to his need. Not that you'll decide what you should give him based on how you feel and all this. And is he really that much in need? Couldn't he sell off his TV before I give him $1 to help him pay his rent? I've seen too much of that kind of stuff. It ultimately at its core, it's a selfishness because you aren't opening your hand wide to your brethren. And if God was that selfish, if he looked at you and said, gosh, this guy doesn't deserve my mercy, because we don't. And no matter how much we think we do, from God's holy perspective, we fall short. And if he closed his hand to helping us, where would we be? See, we want a wide hand opened up to us, but we don't want to open our hand wide to others because ultimately we're selfish. At the end of the day, it's just one excuse or another. Oh, I don't want to give money to that bum. He's going to go spend it on drugs. At the end of the day, you just didn't give him anything to help him. You closed your hand to him. And you don't know. As Mashiach said, when I was hungry and you fed me not, and I was thirsty, you gave me not, I was naked and you clothed me not. You don't know if that's Mashiach that you're doing it to. You have no idea, because people are quick to close their hand. The fact of the matter is, nobody asked you, whether or not, you're going to follow that dollar and make sure it was used for perfection and holiness. Can your dollars be followed to perfection and holiness? Have you ever bought a latte? Is that really a good use when there's probably a Messianic brother somewhere that is struggling, his family doesn't have enough food or money, and you bought a latte once in your life? I mean, did you diligently search out and go, before I spend this $4, is there a brother that is in need before I am wasteful with this dollar? See, the fact is it's hypocrisy. We didn't do that. We don't think about our dollars that way. We don't think about how we use our money so carefully. But when it comes to giving to the poor, boy, we better make diligent search, because I need to know exactly how he's going to spend this. And I need to know that it's only used for his bare essentials. Well, then get rid of everything you have that's not bare essentials and give it away all to the poor. The fact is, you just don't want to help the poor. So just admit it. Just say, I want to keep my dollar. And keep your dollar, because that's what you did anyway. At the end of the day, you're not sensitive to his needs. And you don't care, because most of those people, if they really cared, they would go around, drive around to the store, find out, sit down and talk with him. What are your needs? I know I'm going home to try and watch some TV, but what are your needs? It looks like you need shoes. I'm going to run down, because I don't want you to spend it on drugs, but I do want to help you. I'm going to run down and buy you a new pair of shoes. What size are you? And make sure that you have shoes, or that you have a coat that's worthy enough. It's getting cold out. That's the BS I call. If people really wanted to help somebody, then there'd be fruit of that. But there's no fruit. They just look and find any excuse why they can close their hand and drive off, and they don't go back and help the person. So don't tell me that it's because you're worried about how the person will use the money. Because if that's even the case, even if you were saying, oh, I don't want to help homeless people, it's their choice. Well, you probably never suffered great financial burden or come from poverty, because that's just an ignorant position. But even if that's your position, go ahead and have it. But then make sure you drive down to the women's shelter, the donate to the NICU or the children's, or even other people of your own faith who I guarantee are in your own city that you neglected to even ask if anyone needs anything. Because it isn't that you are such a righteous, charitable person that you should pat yourself on the back, but at the same time, you're careful with how you do your charity. I call BS on it. But this goes back to, again, I observe people in the same way I observe the text. You got to run through all these tests. You got to put it through the challenges. You got to see the options. And this third portion of this week's Parashat about the poor, if there's any poor, open your hand wide. That's what it says. If you do less than that, you're just not keeping the spirit of it, right? Because the spirit doesn't, even the literal doesn't tell you to sit there and make a checklist and only give the scholarship of your worthy dollar that God blessed you with, that you really don't deserve. Because the last week's Parashat says it's God that gives the power to gain wealth. So who are you to hold on to that dollar and say, by the might of my own hand I made this dollar because I'm worthy and responsible and not lazy? And who is this guy who dares ask me for some money? That's a joke, You need to study your scriptures more. And you're going to open up, you've been commanded to open your hand wide, to pay attention, to observe the poor, the widow, and the fatherless. Most people, their eyes are shut to it. They've never been that way. They have misconceptions of how people get that way, or how easy. 87 million, poverty has been around since people have been around. And they think that, if they just decided, there's people who are poor who work 2 jobs. There's immigrants who come over and work way harder than you dream of working and still don't have very much money. And, so don't, demean them by oversimplifying things and making slanderous remarks to their character when you can't characterize a group of 10 people all the same way, let alone 1 million people. Everybody's different, and you don't know their situations, and you don't care, because otherwise you'd have a broader view. So when we see this, we see that the poor are going to be among you. It talks about the Yovel, the year of tithe. It's considering your servants. It's considering the poor. You have to open up your eyes to it. And then have a desire to bless your servant, as we saw in this week's Parashat. As he's leaving, you don't say, oh, you worked for me these 7 years. Thanks a lot. Now get out of here. You're actually supposed to furnish him abundantly as he's going away. You're not going to get anything by giving him a whole bunch from your flocks or all this and that. Is nothing in it for you. That goes back to what we were just talking about people giving because they feel they gave to the right person or it makes them feel good about giving. It isn't about you. It's about helping the poor. Even if there's nothing for you to gain, even if you lose $1 because you gave it to the wrong person. That's what this is talking about. It's saying that you furnish them, you give of yourself, even when they're going away and nothing's going to come back to you. Okay? That's the heart of giving, furnishing your servant. And, of course, if the servant wants to serve you and loves you and wants to stay, then that is an even bigger blessing. And that's a reflection of who you are as a servant. So this really tells us how we treat people, that we should observe, how we treat our servants if they want to stay with us, even when they could leave, how we treat them when they're leaving, how we treat the poor. Do we recognize them? Do we see them? Do we do anything when we go by them? And this desire to bless the servant, this firstling of your flock, same thing. It's the best. Our first thought with the firstlings of our flock that are dedicated to YHWH, they're usually the strongest and the best, and we like to keep that for ourselves. And the fact is, if we observe what it's saying, the mechanics of it, it's saying, those are the things that you're going to give up. The best of what you have, you're going to give up. That really proves your willingness to give to YHWH, to your Creator. Don't give Him your worst. Don't give Him your least, your minimalist thinking, the worst of your flock. You should give Him the best of your flock, the perfect in your flock, the firstlings, the strongest one, the one that you would want to keep the most. When you give the best to God, then, just like Abraham giving up his son, that's really showing your heart for God. It shows the inside by the outside. So, as we see, we're supposed to observe the feast, to finish off with a feast. We're supposed to examine, give the best of our flocks. Before we give an offering, we're supposed to examine it. That's like our choices. It's the re'eh. We're supposed to behold and think about what we do before we make the choice. And make a choice that is going to be the best choice, the best offering we have. It all comes down to observation. You have to start by looking for more ways, more things in the Torah that we can observe. And then you get more details and the richness comes out of it. The depth comes out of it. Stop being a dog and accepting simple theologies and simple thinking. Start to study your word. Start to fellowship the correct way. Start to learn how to argue and grow from it. And learn the power of observation, because that will, just like choosing and observing the benefits of obeying the commandments, the blessings and the cursings, that'll be everything. That's the power of observation. I hope yours expands. I hope mine expands. I hope this was a blessing. And until next time, I'll say Shalom.